The wound in his backside had stopped bleeding hours ago, but the pain had not stopped and would not stop for the rest of the night. Charles Windolph was 24 years old, a German immigrant who had joined the U.S. cavalry because it paid $13 a month, and because America seemed like the kind of place where a man with no money and bad English could disappear into something larger than himself. On the evening of June 25, 1876, he was crouching behind a dead horse on a hilltop in Montana with a single-shot Springfield that jammed every fourth round, an empty canteen, and the growing certainty that something catastrophic had happened 4 miles to the north. He could not see it. He could not confirm it. But the gunfire that had been rolling from that direction all afternoon had stopped, not tapered off, stopped, the way a heartbeat stops. 220 soldiers had ridden north with Custer that morning. Not one of them would ever ride back, but Windolph did not know that yet. He would not know until 2 days later when he walked the field and saw what was left of them. What he knew on this evening was simpler and more immediate. The wounded were screaming for water. There was no water. The sun was going down, and the man the entire hilltop was counting on to save them was already dead in the dirt 4 miles away, surrounded by the bodies of every soldier who had followed him. The United States was celebrating its centennial year, 100 years of independence. Fireworks were being planned in Philadelphia, but on the northern Great Plains, a different reckoning was unfolding. The federal government had issued an ultimatum to the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne. Report to your reservations by January 31, 1876, or be declared hostile. Thousands ignored it. By summer, the largest gathering of Plains warriors in living memory had assembled in the valleys of southeastern Montana. The Army sent 3 columns to force them in. Custer commanded one of them. He had graduated dead last in his West Point class, risen to brevet general by 25 through sheer recklessness during the Civil War, charging when sane men hesitated, surviving through a combination of courage and luck so extreme that his men called him Lucky Custer. By 1876, the luck was fraying. He was 36. His career had been tarnished by political scandal and a public feud with President Grant that nearly cost him his command. He had been court-martialed once already for abandoning his post to visit his wife. The golden hair, the custom uniforms, the newspaper celebrity, all of it was built on a foundation that was cracking. He needed a victory the way a drowning man needs air. Every decision he made on the morning of June 25 reflects that desperation. Around noon, Custer made the decision that would define the battle and destroy his command. He divided the 7th Cavalry into 3 groups. Captain Frederick Benteen received companies H, D, and K. Roughly 125 men. Orders: scout the bluffs to the south. Benteen, a veteran officer who privately despised Custer, considered the order pointless, a wild goose chase designed to keep him away from the action. Major Marcus Reno received companies M, A, and G, plus the Arikara and Crow Scouts, roughly 140 men. Orders: cross the Little Bighorn and charge the southern end of the village. Custer himself took the largest force, companies C, E, F, I, and L, approximately 220 men. He would swing north along the bluffs, strike the village from a second direction, and catch the enemy between converging attacks. No written orders were issued. The plan existed only in Custer's mind. The 3 columns separated and rode apart across the broken Montana landscape. They would never reunite. Custer divided a force that was already outnumbered against an enemy whose strength he had not bothered to verify. Across terrain he had never scouted. With no communication plan between units that could not see each other, with no reserve, with no fallback position, with 100 rounds per man and single-shot carbines that jammed every 3rd round. Remember the number 220. Remember where they rode, north, along the bluffs, into the rolling hills above the river, into silence. Windolph rode with Benteen. They scouted the hills to the south and found nothing. Empty bluffs, dry ravines. Benteen turned his companies back toward the main trail, then, faintly, carried on the wind from somewhere north and west. Windolph heard it. Distant gunfire. Rolling across the valley like summer thunder. Something was happening at the river. Reno's 140 men splashed across the Little Bighorn around 2 in the afternoon. They shook out into a textbook skirmish line and advanced at a gallop toward the southern edge of the village. For the first few hundred yards it almost worked. The formation held. The horses ran true. Then the warriors appeared. Not dozens, not hundreds. Between 1,500 and 2,500 fighters poured from the village and from the ravines on the flanks. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, mounted and on foot. Armed with Winchesters and Henrys and bows and war clubs, the sound hit first. A rolling wall of war cries and rifle fire that drowned out the bugles trying to signal commands. The ground trembled under the hooves of hundreds of warrior ponies converging from 3 directions at once. Repeating rifles, Winchesters and Henrys that could fire 15 rounds without reloading announced themselves with a sustained crackling roar that made the Springfield sound like a man clapping in a thunderstorm. Reno halted the charge after advancing half a mile, dismounted, formed a skirmish line. Now his men were stationary targets for warriors who outnumbered them 10 to 1. The position collapsed in minutes. Reno ordered retreat to a cottonwood grove near the river. The grove offered no real cover. Warriors infiltrated from all sides, firing at point-blank range. Horses stampeded through the line, carrying saddlebags packed with ammunition into the brush. Men who had carried 100 rounds found themselves down to whatever remained in their belts. Reno ordered retreat to the bluffs across the river. What followed was not a withdrawal, it was a rout. Men scrambled for horses and spurred for the river at a dead gallop, riding through warriors who slashed at them as they passed. The Little Bighorn was chest-deep in places. Troopers plunged in fully clothed, the weight of wet cartridge belts dragging them under. Bullets and arrows tore into them from both banks. A man hit in the water simply sank. Nobody could help him. The river ran brown downstream for hours. On the eastern side, survivors clawed up crumbling bluffs, fully exposed to fire from below, hands tearing at clay, fingernails breaking on rock. Behind them, the sounds of men dying in the water mixed with war cries in languages they had never heard before this afternoon. They reached the top, gasping, bleeding, and wild-eyed. In less than 90 minutes, Reno's command had gone from a parade ground charge to a shattered mob on a hilltop with dwindling ammunition, no water, and no idea where Custer was. Benteen's column arrived around 4 in the afternoon to find chaos. Wounded men scattered across the hilltop. Reno dazed, his face spattered with the blood and brains of a scout shot beside him during the retreat. No coherent command structure. Officers arguing. Enlisted men staring blankly at the valley below. Windolph saw it through the eyes of a man riding into someone else's catastrophe. The men on the hilltop were hollow-faced. Some were openly weeping. The wounded moaned in the afternoon heat, calling for water that did not exist on this barren crown of earth. Benteen took command. He walked upright along the line of prone soldiers, pointing out targets and rallying men by name, his voice carrying over the gunfire like a closing gate slamming shut. He did not duck. He did not flinch. Men who had been weeping 5 minutes earlier found themselves digging rifle pits because a grizzled captain with a white mustache told them to dig, and his voice left no room for discussion. Windolph watched him and thought, that man is either the bravest officer in the army or the most reckless. The distinction did not matter. What mattered was that men who had given up started fighting again. Benteen ordered saddles, packs, and dead horse carcasses dragged into a rough, oval breastwork. The pack train arrived with reserve ammunition on panicked mules. A lifeline. But distributing cartridges to intermixed, disorganized companies took time the Hilltop did not have. Warriors probed from all directions, darting in on horseback or on foot, snapping off shots, pulling back before soldiers could respond with concentrated fire, testing for weakness. Not a full assault, not yet. Something worse was building. Captain Thomas Weir could not stand the inaction. Around 4:30, without clear authorization, he led Company D north along the ridgeline, trying to push toward where Custer's 5 companies had ridden hours earlier. Other companies followed in partial support. They reached a high point about a mile north. What Weir saw stopped him cold. 3 to 4 miles away, the terrain was alive with movement. Dust hanging in columns, smoke drifting from fires that should not be burning on a battlefield. Figures on horseback moving across distant hills. But they were not cavalry. No guidons snapping in the wind. No formations. No blue columns riding in order. Just warriors, hundreds of them, moving in loose masses across ridgelines that should have been occupied by 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry. And on the ground between Weir's position and those distant hills, scattered across the slopes and draws, shapes. Dark shapes on pale grass, lying still, too many to count at that distance, too still to be alive. Weir looked at those shapes and understood something that his mind refused to assemble into a coherent thought. Those shapes were the 220 men who had ridden north with Custer. They were not coming back. Then the warriors turned toward Weir, hundreds peeling away from whatever they had been doing to the north and riding hard for the exposed company. Weir's men were driven back to the main perimeter in a fighting retreat that nearly became a second rout. Warriors swarmed toward the exposed company from 3 directions, firing from horseback with Winchesters that cracked 5 rounds for every Springfield round that answered. Company D lost men on the run back. Bodies left on the trail between Weir's Point and the main position that would not be recovered until Terry arrived 2 days later. They reached the hilltop just ahead of the pursuing warriors, and the entire perimeter contracted into a tighter oval. The men on the hilltop now knew something they had been afraid to admit. Whatever Weir had seen on those distant hills, those dark shapes on pale grass, those motionless forms scattered across slopes that should have been occupied by cavalry, it was not good. Nobody spoke it. Everyone felt it. But something was wrong, something no one wanted to say out loud. It had been hours since anyone had heard from Custer. No messenger, no bugle calls, no dust cloud of approaching cavalry, just silence from that direction, and the distant rolling sound of gunfire that had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. That silence was the most terrifying sound Charles Windolph had ever heard. 310 men formed a rough, oval perimeter on the bluffs. Some sections had cartridges stacked in neat rows. Others scraped rounds from the belts of the dead. Windolph lay in Company H's section, pressed behind the swelling carcass of a dead horse, his Springfield leveled across the animal's ribs. The smell was what he would remember most: bloating horseflesh and black powder smoke mixing with sage and dust. It coated the back of his throat and never quite left. For the rest of his life, the smell of sage would take him back to that hilltop. Night fell. There was no full assault. Instead, there was something worse: darkness, thirst, and the sound of the wounded. Windolph lay in his shallow rifle pit, unable to stretch his legs without exposing himself to fire. The wound in his buttock throbbed with every heartbeat, a deep, grinding ache that ran down his leg and made every shift of position a negotiation with pain. He could feel the dried blood on his trousers stiffening in the cooling night air. His Springfield lay across his chest, barrel pointed at darkness that could contain anything. Around him, wounded soldiers cried for water. The cries had a rhythm to them. A man would call out, then silence. Then another voice, from a different part of the perimeter. Then silence again. Then the first voice, weaker now. The intervals between cries grew longer as the night went on. Whether that meant the wounded were sleeping or dying, Windolph could not tell. There was none. The nearest water was the river at the base of the bluffs. 200 feet below, through ground that crawled with warriors. No one was going down there in the dark. Windolph wrote later. We still had heard no word from Custer. We began to suspicion that some terrible fate might have overtaken him. What it was, we could only guess. Not lucky Custer and those 5 gallant troops who rode with him. Read those words again. Not lucky Custer. The phrase carried a weight that is impossible to feel unless you have been on a hilltop at night, surrounded by enemies, listening to your friends die slowly, and placing your last hope in a man whose luck was the only thing standing between you and the same fate. The phrase, "Lucky Custer," landed like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone on that hilltop knew the nickname. Everyone had heard it used with envy and admiration for years. Now every man was thinking the same thing, and no one wanted to say it. The silence from the north was no longer a mystery. It was an answer, and every man on that hilltop felt it in his gut. Imagine standing on that barren hill as darkness falls. No water, no relief column, the wounded gasping in the black. And to the north, where 220 of your comrades rode hours ago, nothing, absolute nothing. The longest night any of them would ever live through stretched from sunset to the first gray light of June 26. Some men prayed. Some dug their rifle pits deeper with bare hands, fingernails splitting on Montana hardpan. Some simply stared into the darkness and waited for whatever was coming next. The stars came out, indifferent, beautiful. The same stars that had watched over Lakota camps for 10,000 years now watched over the men who had come to destroy those camps and were instead lying in holes in the ground, wondering if they would see morning. Coyotes began to howl from the ridges. Someone whispered that the howls sounded like they were coming from the direction of Custer's column. Another voice told him to shut up. In the dark, a wounded man began singing a hymn in a voice so broken it barely carried 10 feet. Nobody told him to stop. The song ended when his voice gave out. Whether he lived until morning, Windolph never said. And somewhere in the dark, warriors were moving into position for dawn. Dawn, June 26. The warriors resumed firing with the first light. The hilltop became a killing ground of slow attrition. Sharpshooters who had crept into position during the night fired with patient accuracy. Men picked off one by one. But the greatest enemy was no longer bullets. It was thirst, tongues swelling, lips split and bleeding, the wounded delirious, clawing at the dirt, begging for water that no one had. A decision was made. Someone had to get to the river. Volunteers were called. The mission was simple to describe and suicidal to attempt. Slide down the exposed bluff to the river with canteens and kettles. Fill them under direct fire from warriors in the ravines. Climb back up 200 feet of crumbling slope, carrying water that sloshed and spilled with every step, every foot of the route visible to the enemy. A man carrying a full kettle up that slope was the slowest, most exposed target on the battlefield. He could not run. He could not drop flat. He could not let go of the kettle because the water in it was worth more than his life to the 310 men waiting above. Windolph volunteered not to carry water, but to cover the carriers. He and a small group of sharpshooters took up firing positions where they could suppress the ravines while the water carriers made their runs. The carriers went in pairs, sliding on their bellies down the bluff face. Canteens clanking against rocks. Each trip took an eternity measured in heartbeats and incoming fire. A trooper named Peter Thompson crouched at the river's edge, filling kettles, while bullets kicked up spouts of water inches from his hands. He filled one kettle, then another, his back to the bluff, his face to the enemy, knowing that the sound of water hitting tin was telling every warrior within earshot exactly where he was. Windolph fired methodically from above. Aim, fire, extract the casing, Reload. The Springfield demanded perfect discipline. Miss and you have wasted 1 of 100 rounds. Jam and you are dead. Every shot was a calculation. Is the target worth the cartridge? Is the movement in the brush a warrior or a shadow? Can I afford to fire and reveal my position? He found a rhythm that blocked out everything except the next round. Pick a target. Wait for movement. Squeeze. Do not flinch. Do not think about the wound in your backside, or the thirst cracking your lips, or the dead horse you are using as a pillow. Think only about the front sight and the trigger, and the man in the ravine who is trying to kill the soldier crawling down the bluff with an empty kettle. The warriors in the nearest ravine learned to respect the position. Their fire slackened, shifted to other sectors. The carriers scrambled back up with water sloshing from the kettles. Charles Windolph was not a hero from a novel. He was a 24-year-old immigrant with a bullet wound in his backside and dirt caked into the creases of his knuckles. He did not think about glory. He thought about the next cartridge and the next and the next. For courageously holding a position that secured water for the command, Windolph and 3 of his comrades received the Medal of Honor. The citation specifically noted his role as a sharpshooter covering the water carriers on June 26, 1876. Benteen promoted the young German immigrant to sergeant on the spot, a battlefield promotion earned not with a saber but with a canteen and a carbine. The water reached the wounded. Men wept. Grown soldiers, men who had charged cavalry lines and fought hand-to-hand in the Civil War, wept at the taste of river water from a tin kettle. Some were too far gone to drink. Their throats, so swollen from 18 hours without water in 95 degrees Fahrenheit, that the first mouthful made them choke and gag. Medics poured water onto cloths and pressed them against cracked lips. They squeezed drops into mouths that had forgotten how to swallow. One soldier reportedly died with the first drink of water touching his tongue. His body had given up the ability to process the thing it needed most. But the Hilltop held. The water carriers had bought time, and time was the only currency that mattered on that hilltop. Every hour they held was an hour closer to Terry's relief column. Every hour they held was an hour the 310 men on that barren crown of earth stayed alive through sheer discipline and tin kettles filled under fire. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the warriors disappeared. Early afternoon of June 26, the firing slackened and stopped. The massive encampment below began to move. Thousands of people, horses, travois, dogs streaming south up the valley in a column that stretched for miles. The village was leaving. Women carried children. Old men rode ponies loaded with belongings. Warriors who had been firing at the hilltop minutes earlier now rode escort alongside their families, their attention no longer on the soldiers above, but on the horizon ahead. They knew what was coming. The army would return. It always did. And this time it would come with a fury that matched the scale of the defeat it had just suffered. The Lakota and Cheyenne had won the battle. They were already beginning to lose the war. No one on the hilltop celebrated. The question that had haunted them for 36 hours was still unanswered. Where was Custer? Some speculated he had linked up with General Terry's column. Others said nothing. They had heard the silence from that direction for over 24 hours. They knew. The answer came the next morning, June 27th. The advanced scouts of Terry's relief column reached the hilltop. The siege was over, but the soldiers who arrived brought no celebration, only urgent questions and grim faces. They pushed north along the bluffs. What they found 4 miles from the hilltop ended all speculation, and ended something inside every man who saw it. 210 bodies scattered across ridges and ravines over an area of nearly 2 square miles, not in formation, not in defensive positions. Scattered the way leaves scatter when wind blows through a pile. Some lay behind the carcasses of horses they had shot for barricades. Others sprawled in clusters of 3 or 4 where they had been overtaken running. Still others lay alone in ravines, separated from their units, killed in isolation, with no one to witness their deaths. The bodies had been in 95 degrees Fahrenheit heat for 2 days, bloated beyond recognition, stripped, mutilated. The smell reached the search parties before the site did. Officers who had served through the bloodiest campaigns of the Civil War turned away and vomited. Windolph was among those who walked the field. 74 years later, he could still describe specific bodies in specific positions. The young trumpeter from Company E, who had played cards with him 3 nights before, lying face down in a ravine with his hands still reaching forward as if crawling toward water he never reached. The sergeant who had loaned him tobacco that morning, unrecognizable except for the tattoo on his forearm. He saw men he had shared meals with, men he had drilled beside, men whose voices he could still hear in his memory, lying in the Montana dirt in conditions that no description in any memoir has ever fully conveyed. Not because the words did not exist, because some things resist language. Custer's body was found on the hill that would bear his name. Windolph stood over it. The man he had spent 36 hours hoping would ride to the rescue lay in the dirt, with 2 bullet wounds and a face already changed by heat and time. The golden hair was gone, cut short before the campaign. The uniform was gone, stripped by warriors. The legend was gone. What remained was a body that looked smaller than the man who had filled every room he entered. Windolph stared at it and felt something he could not name for 74 years. Not grief, not anger. Something closer to the feeling you get when you finally see behind a curtain and discover the stage is empty. 220 men, not one survivor. The answer was worse than anything the Hilltop had imagined. The news reached the East Coast in early July. Headlines screamed, "Massacre." The nation's centennial celebration was poisoned by rage and grief. Within months, the Army launched massive retaliatory campaigns that broke the power of the Lakota and Cheyenne and forced them onto reservations permanently. The great victory at the Little Bighorn became the beginning of the end for the people who won it. The Lakota and Cheyenne won the battle. The United States won the war. Between those 2 facts lies one of the cruelest ironies in American history. For Charles Windolph, the battle never really ended. In the decades after 1876, Little Bighorn was mythologized beyond recognition. Custer became a martyred hero in paintings, poems, and dime novels. The golden-haired cavalier, who died bravely surrounded by his men, pistol in hand, saber at his side. The reality, a botched reconnaissance, a fragmented command, a leader who divided his forces against an enemy he had fatally underestimated, was buried as deeply as the bodies on the field. The men who actually survived, the ones who held the hilltop, who carried water under fire, who lay in rifle pits through the longest night of their lives, were largely forgotten. The public wanted the legend of the last stand, not the grim truth of the defense that kept 310 men alive. Windolph watched this happen for 74 years. He watched school children memorize poems about Custer's heroic last stand, while the men who actually survived were not mentioned in a single textbook. He watched statues go up in town squares, honoring the man who led 220 soldiers to their deaths, while the man who carried water under fire to keep 310 alive was never asked to speak at a single dedication. He watched the battle become a story about one man dying instead of a story about 310 men living, and he said nothing for decades because nobody asked, and because the story the nation wanted was not the story he had. His story had no golden-haired hero. His story had a hilltop that smelled like dead horses. His story had men screaming for water in the dark. His story had a 24-year-old immigrant crawling on his belly to fill a kettle while bullets hit the water 6 inches from his hands. That was not a story America wanted to buy. He was discharged in 1883. He settled in the Black Hills of South Dakota, married, and lived a life so quiet It could have belonged to any retired soldier in any small town in America. One by one, the other survivors died. The ranks thinned with each passing decade. By the 1930s, Windolph was the last living white veteran of the battle. Journalists sought him out. They found a lean old man with steady eyes who told his story with the same measured tone that marks every page of his memoir. No bravado, no embellishment, just the facts of what he saw and what he did. He did not tell the story the nation wanted to hear. He told the story that actually happened. A hilltop, a bullet wound, a canteen, men screaming for water in the dark, and 4 miles to the north, silence, where 220 voices used to be. He died on March 11, 1950, at the age of 98. Medal of Honor winner, water carrier's protector, the last man who could say, "I was there." The battle belongs to Custer in the history books. But it survived in living memory because of the men who held a hilltop and refused to die. A 24-year-old German immigrant, a bullet wound, a single-shot carbine. 4 miles away, 220 men already dead. He did not know Custer was dead. He did not know the gunfire stopped because there was no one left to fire. He knew only that the wounded were screaming for water, and someone had to hold the line until morning. So he did, and he spent 74 years watching America worship the man who died, while forgetting the men who lived. The legend belonged to Custer. The truth belonged to Windolph. America chose the legend.